The Marines' combat experience in Korea began shortly after the conclusion of the American Civil War. An American military expeditionary force was ordered to Korea to support a diplomatic delegation sent to establish trade and political relations with the Asian nation. They also came to determine the fate of the merchant ship SS General Sherman. The General Sherman attempted to open Korea to trade in 1866. After an initial miscommunication, the ship sailed upriver and became stranded near the ancient city of Pyongyang. After being ordered to leave by the Korean government, the American crew killed 4 Korean civilians, kidnapped a military officer, and engaged in sporadic fighting with local militia over the next 4 days. After 2 efforts to destroy the ship failed, the USS General Sherman was finally set afire by Korean fire ships laden with primitive explosives. When the Americans inquired about the SS General Sherman incident, the Koreans were initially reluctant to discuss the topic, ostensibly to avoid having to pay any recompense. The Americans consequently let the Koreans know that their fleet would be exploring the area. It was Korean policy at the time to prohibit foreign ships from sailing on the Han River, as it led directly to the capital city of Hanyang, modern-day Seoul. On June 1st, the Korean protective fortress fired at the U.S. fleet as they sailed up the Gangwon Straits, which led to the river. The U.S. forces were not badly damaged due to the bad gunnery of the Koreans. When, in their judgment, no satisfactory explanation for this action was offered to them, the Americans planned a punitive assault. The expedition consisted of about 650 men, over 500 sailors, and 100 Marines, as well as 5 warships. The United States won a quick military victory. 9 sailors and 6 Marines were awarded the Medal of Honor, the first for actions in a foreign conflict. Even by force of arms, the United States failed to open up the country. This was a situation that was to repeat itself almost 100 years later. Since the time of Peter the Great, the Russians have been in constant pursuit of a warm water port on the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific seaport of Vladivostok was operational only during the summer season. The Russian Tsar began to turn an envious eye toward the Luodong Peninsula and its excellent natural harbor at Port Arthur. But Russia was not the only empire with imperial ambitions towards Manchuria and Korea. The Japanese also wanted to claim the region. Negotiations between the Tsar's government and Japan had proved futile. Japan chose war to protect its country by maintaining exclusive dominance in Korea.
After we opened up Japan in 1854 with Commodore Perry, the Japanese grew quite rapidly with their population. And a place they saw as an expansion was Korea because it's very close geographically to Japan.
By 1898, the Russians began to make inroads into Korea. They acquired mining and forestry concessions near the Yalu River and began construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway. This and the appearance of a Russian fleet in the Pacific caused the Japanese emperor much anxiety. Japan decided to strike. Japan issued a declaration of war on February 8, 1904. However, 3 hours before Japan's declaration of war was received by the Russian government, the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked the Russian Far East Fleet at Port Arthur. Tsar Nicholas II was stunned by news of the attack. He could not believe that Japan would commit an act of war without a formal declaration, and had been assured by his ministers that the Japanese would not fight.
It was also the fact that Russia considered herself to be one of the better powers in the world, and after all, the Tsar of Russia, and especially his wife, Alexandra, was a first cousin of the German Kaiser and the English king, and so they were all related. And during this time, it was very embarrassing for him to be fighting a war against a country which was considered to be a very minor country, and at the same time, the war was so far away, and they were trying to save face.
The war was a logistical nightmare for the Russian military.
So the Russians basically had to get their troops over there through the railroad, and when they did get most of their troops over there, it became a real difficult situation.
The resulting campaign, in which the fledgling Japanese military consistently defeated the Russian forces arrayed against them, was totally unexpected by world military experts.
In that particular war, it was a battle in which the Russians were completely out of their element, in the sense that they had so far to come from Moscow and St. Petersburg. Their navy got completely obliterated at Tsushima Straits by the Japanese, because the Russian ships were very, very ancient, and they were just completely loaded down with people coming all the way around the world, through the Cape of around Africa, all the way through India, and by the time they got there, they were seasick as could be. The Japanese just let them come single file right in the thing, and they took the two sides and just annihilated them immediately.
The defeats of the Russian Army and Navy shook Russian confidence. Throughout 1905, the Imperial Russian government was rocked by revolution. Tsar Nicholas II elected to negotiate peace so he could concentrate on resolving internal matters. The American president, Theodore Roosevelt, offered to mediate.
And Teddy Roosevelt decided that he would solve this problem to the benefit of hopefully both parties, though the Japanese didn't exactly look at it that way, by having representatives from Russia and from Japan come to meet him at Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1905. At the treaty, pretty much Teddy used his big stick and determined what would happen, which did give the Japanese interest in Korea. And by 1910, they basically had pretty much annexed it and become part of a Japanese group.
The peace treaty also earned militaristic Teddy the Nobel Peace Prize. No one knows for sure the cost of this Korean War. The number of Japanese dead in combat is put at around 47,000, with around 80,000 if disease is included. Estimates of Russian dead range from around 40,000 to around 70,000. Politically, the outcome of the war was far-reaching. This was the first major victory of an Asian power over a European one in the modern era. Japan's prestige rose greatly as it began to be considered a modern great power. At the same time, Russia lost virtually its entire Pacific and Baltic fleets, as well as international esteem. These victories, as time transpired, would dramatically transform the balance of power in East Asia, resulting in a reassessment of Japan's recent entry onto the world stage. The embarrassing string of defeats increased the Russian populace's dissatisfaction with the inefficient and corrupt Tsarist government and proved a major cause of the Russian Revolution of 1905. In the absence of Russian competition, and with the distraction of European nations during World War I, combined with the Great Depression which followed, the Japanese military began its efforts to dominate China and the rest of Asia. These actions eventually led to the Second Sino-Japanese War, and the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
During World War II, the Koreans were forced to support the Japanese war effort. Tens of thousands of men were conscripted into Japan's military. Around 200,000 girls and women, mostly from Korea and China, were conscripted as sex slaves, euphemistically called comfort women. Before the Second World War ended, the three major Allied nations began to discuss the post-war world in a series of conferences with the three leaders. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met at Yalta in March 1945, and Truman, Attlee, and Stalin met in Potsdam in July 1945.
Originally, by the Cairo Agreement of 1943, anybody at that particular time, that any disagreements when the war ended would be resolved so that the people would be able to vote themselves as to which way they wanted to go.
The reality was that huge cracks were appearing in the Allied unity. With no more enemies to fight, the suspicions held at bay until victory was obvious became public and bitter. Churchill later wrote that he already suspected the Soviets were replacing the Axis as the aggressors before the European war ended.
It has to go back to the initial ending of World War II in the Pacific because Joe Stalin of the Soviet Union had been telling both Roosevelt and Churchill that he would be basically entering into the Pacific theater soon. They didn't know when soon was, but when he never got into it, the war with Germany was over. Harry Truman was now president after Roosevelt died in April of 1945, and Harry Truman was trying to find a way to end this particular war, and they had an agreement to meet at Potsdam, which is a suburb of Berlin, to deal with what they thought at that time would be nothing more than dealing with how to deal with the war in Germany and solve all the problems. And it became quite evident that Harry Truman, the more he read about the two previous engagements, that this man was supposed to come into the war. And then when he found out about the atomic weapon and how during the middle of the Potsdam Conference, Harry Truman decided if he was ever going to use it, he would use it before the Soviets came in, because Joe Stalin said he would come in on August the 8th. We dropped the first atomic bomb on August the 6th. When the Japanese didn't surrender, we dropped the second one on Nagasaki on August the 9th. The Russians did come in on August the 8th, and when they came in through Korea.
The Russians entered the war on August 8th. Their advance on the Asian mainland took them into Korea as far as the 38th parallel. U.S. troops also landed in Korea, and as a result, Russian troops occupied the north, while American forces occupied the south.
-5 seconds.
At the end of the war, America, enjoying a brief monopoly on the atom bomb, conducted tests in the Bikini Atoll on July 25, 1946. The world was impressed by the casual destruction of so many warships as much as it was by the bomb itself. The Berlin airlift heightened the Cold War tensions in 1948. In 1949, the Western powers came together to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO.
We have to also realize that the United States foreign policy changed dramatically in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine was the first time we decided we were going to be involved in something in which war had not been declared. And Truman got Congress to approve giving military assistance in money into Greece and Turkey to save them from falling into the hands of Joe Stalin and the Communist Party. We started seeing what was happening in Eastern Europe. Later, that became the Marshall Plan in 1948. We had the Berlin airlift in 1948-49. We saw that NATO was created in 1949 to stop Western Europe from falling into the hands of the communists. And in 1949, the Russians developed the atomic weapon. And as a result, that was setting a stage for what was to eventually come.
When the Soviets, and soon the French, British, and Chinese acquired the bomb, huge arsenals were quickly built. The ability to annihilate the planet many times over evolved into the concept of mutual assured destruction, MAD, which meant that neither side would start a war if they were guaranteed to be destroyed. This meant that full-scale war was out of the question. The major powers began to look at brushfire wars as a mean to advance their political ambitions. In the Pacific, the seeds for more conflict were being sown all over Asia. As the Soviets moved into the northern part of Korea, U.S. troops landed at Incheon to begin the occupation of the South. With their focus overwhelmingly being on Japan, the American military authorities paid much less attention to Korea, and soldiers generally did not want to be assigned there. General MacArthur had appointed Lieutenant General John R. Hodge to administer Korean affairs. It was an assignment he did not want and was ill-prepared to carry out. On September 9th, the Provisional Government of the Republic of Korea sent a delegation with 3 interpreters to meet with the American general. The purpose was to discuss setting up a unified government and early elections. But Hodge refused to meet with them. While America's former enemy Japan was put under the administration of civilians, liberated Korea was placed under the direct administration of military units.
But here in this particular part of the world, people assumed that in Korea, that ultimately the people would determine themselves which way the country would go, and they would have some form of election. But in reality, by 1948, the North had developed into we called the North Korea today, and for lack of better terms, we'll call the Republic of Korea South Korea.
The U.S. occupation authorities in southern Korea viewed many indigenous attempts at government as a communist insurgency and refused to recognize the provisional government. However, an anti-communist named Syngman Rhee, who moved back to Korea after decades of exile in the U.S., was considered an acceptable candidate to lead the country. Under Rhee, the southern government conducted a number of military campaigns against left-wing insurgents who took up arms against the government. He also crushed any other political opponents. In the north, the Soviet Army established the Soviet Civil Authority to rule the country until a domestic regime, friendly to the USSR, could be established. Provisional committees were set up across the country, putting communists into key positions. In February 1946, a provisional government called the North Korean Provisional People's Committee was formed under Kim Il-sung, who had spent the last years of the war training with Soviet troops in Manchuria.
We had 2 strong leaders over there, one in the north, which was Kim Il-sung, and one in the south, which is Syngman Rhee, who had been around for a long time. Syngman Rhee was around during World War I. So both of these men were very strong and determined, and one was being supported by basically the Soviet Union, and one is being supported predominantly by the United States at this particular time.
And both had strong beliefs as to what a unified Korea should be.
Both of these people grew up in an area where they were very, very comfortable. Kim Il-sung was a person who, after being indoctrinated, was determined that, well, the two, let's face it, were basically natural rivals. Kim Il-sung was a little younger than Syngman Rhee. He was a man who saw himself as the future leader of a unified Korea. Syngman Rhee saw himself as the man who should be the leader because he had been around the longest. It was a rival, you could almost call it a political rival, but one had developed in the north, basically, in which he had become under the influence of the Soviet Union, and the other one was going to be basically tied into the United States.
With mistrust growing rapidly between the United States and the Soviet Union, no agreement was reached on how to reconcile the competing provisional governments. The U.S. brought the problem before the newly formed United Nations in the fall of 1947, which the USSR opposed. The UN was created to replace the League of Nations that failed so miserably after the First World War. Roosevelt had first used the term United Nations when 26 nations signed the Declaration of the United Nations on January 1, 1942. From April to October 1945, 51 nations met in San Francisco and created the United Nations. The headquarters were set up in New York after the charter was ratified by a majority of the member nations. The major allies, China, the Soviet Union, France, Great Britain, and the United States, held seats on the Security Council. Each country held veto power over any decision the Security Council made. The UN passed a resolution on November 14, 1947, declaring that free elections should be held in Korea at the earliest possible date. The resolution also stated that foreign troops should be withdrawn and a UN Commission for Korea should be created. The Soviet Union, although a member with veto powers, boycotted the voting and did not consider the resolution to be binding. In April 1948, a conference of organizations from the North and the South met in Pyongyang to plan for a unified general election. This conference produced no results, and the Soviets boycotted the UN-supervised elections in the South. On May 10th, the South held elections. Syngman Rhee, who had called for partial elections in the South to consolidate his power as early as 1947, was elected, though left-wing parties boycotted the election. Widespread corruption was reported in the elections, and the Republic of Korea began life without a great deal of legitimacy. On August 15th, the Republic of Korea formally took over power from the U.S. military. Meanwhile, across the Yalu River in China, another player entered the game for control of the hearts and minds of the Korean people.
Now, China had gone through a major civil war, and that was another big issue because the communists drove the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek to the island of Formosa, which we call Taiwan today, and all of mainland China became Red China in 1949. So the world was set in a stage, and to top everything off in February of 1950, the Soviet Union and Red China signed a 30-year perpetual agreement of friendship between Mao Zedong and Joe Stalin. And we really didn't know what that said. What do you mean by a 30-year friendship? In our eyes, right now, Red China and the Soviet Union are pretty much together. And this was something, these are the two largest communist countries in the world. And that was something that we were setting the political stage for this particular invasion that eventually would come in June.
The Cold War was about to heat up.